Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you a couple seconds to hop on. Hope everybody's having a fabulous Wednesday. Not very long because we have a lot prepared for you today. Great presenter on a great topic and a lot of information. So let's see where everybody's coming on nice and quick. Perfect. Perfect. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. That way, Stephen has plenty of time to get all his information in. First of all, welcome to the Harmony webinar series. My name is Christy Weeks, and I am the Brand and Digital Media Manager for Harmony Foundation. Today's presentation is Addiction Interactions, Identifying and Treating the Neuropathways of Addiction, presented by Stephen Spinotto. He's with Valiant Living, and I know he has a lot ready for you today. So real quick, for those of you who are new to the webinar series, Harmony Foundation is a 43-acre campus up by the Rocky Mountain National Park in Estes Park, and we provide comprehensive treatment for adults and their family members. We do believe that long-term recovery from alcohol and other drugs is possible. We have over 50 years of experience treating addiction. We are a 70-bed residential treatment program. We also have medical detox and an IOP program. So very proud of that. And we have a very robust alumni program that we're also very proud of. We offer evidence-based treatment, 12-step program, and are gender responsive. So if you have any questions about Harmony Foundation, please feel free to reach out to our admissions staff at 866-686-7867, or you can head on over to our website, harmonyfoundationinc.com. I have a couple of quick housekeeping things that I want to go over with you. We do record these webinars, so it will be available to everybody and anybody on our website. Probably be uploaded by end of day on Friday. Hi, everybody who's chiming in. It's good to see you. There will be an evaluation, a survey sent out to you. We would appreciate it if you fill that out and send it back to us. It helps provide us with insight as to what you would like to see in future webinars. We will be sending out your certificate by email, and that will come from me. And if you guys can give me until Tuesday, May 3rd-ish, end of day, I promise you I will have those out to you with all information regarding how to access this webinar and how to register for our next webinar. So this software that we use does track how long you're involved in the webinar, so you must be here for 45 minutes in order to receive that CEU. But if you need to jump off for some reason, go ahead and shoot me an email, let me know, and I'll get you a certificate of attendance. So as far as our presenter today, pretty fabulous. We have Stephen Spinotto. He has been a licensed professional counselor addictions and intimacy disorder treatment at Valiant Living in Greenwood Village, Colorado. He is a certified sexual addictions therapist, supervisor, and truly enjoys helping train therapists learning the Carnes 30 task model for the treatment of sexual addictions and compulsive sexual behaviors. Stephen also did an additional master's program in marriage and family therapy and is trained in emotion-focused couples therapy. He is also trained in EMDR for trauma. Stephen is originally from Arkansas and moved to Colorado 8 years ago. When he is not in the office working with clients and training clinicians, he can often either be found on the theater stage or at the karaoke performing for either willing or Stephen, welcome. A shout out before you take over. If you would like for their partnership, please visit them at valiantliving.com. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but I want to make sure Stephen has enough time to do his thing. So I'm going to stop my share, and it's all you.
Well, hello, everyone. Christy, can you tell me whether or not you can hear me?
I absolutely can. You are good to go.
And if anyone can go ahead and put in the chat real quickly, am I coming through? Can you hear me? Clear.
Clear.
Yeah,
Everybody's
good. Everyone's coming through. Okay, that's perfect. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's do that.
the one thing I wanted to mention, everybody, before I mute myself and let Stephen take over, is if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. All right, it's all yours, Stephen.
Awesome. Okay, so I've got so much to cover today, and this is normally an hour and a half presentation that I'm now gonna try to splice down. So I'm gonna move pretty quickly, and I apologize. I am gonna cover a lot of material really quickly, and I hope you have your listening and thinking caps firmly on, and we're gonna move right through pretty hefty amount of work here, but hopefully it'll be useful. And this is understanding really a combination of a few things. Like the title originally said, looking at multiple addictions, addiction interactions, neural pathways. We're going to cover all that. Because I'm a CSAT, a certified sex addiction therapist, and then I'm a supervisor in that. I'm a CSAT supervisor, and I actually love training other therapists to become CSATs. I'm going to be doing this always with, at least in the background, if not right in the forefront, of understanding how other addictions are interacting with and the neural pathways of sexual addiction. So hold on to your seats there. I have recently been promoted. I am the clinical director here at Valiant Living now, and I'm going to be trial by fire trying to learn what all that means. I'm really very excited to be joining at this kind of next level. I've been a program director for a while now. Here we go. First off, credit where it's due. Let me shrink a window on my screen. There we go. Much appreciation credit goes to Patrick J. Carnes, PhD, CAS, his contributions for decades to the field of sexual addiction and addictions in general. And I want to be very fair. A lot of this is really not my information. I am sourcing from a lot of his work and then trying to put my own spin on it and try to make sense of it as best I can, but it's not original from me. A lot of this is coming from, if you're curious, Facing the Shadows, Chapter 7, and Recovery Zone, Chapter 3. If you don't know what those books are, please reach out and let me know, and I'll gladly get you in touch with that. Come on, screen. There we go. Let me briefly give this a healthy sex and sexuality disclaimer. Though I'm going to be talking about sex and sexuality when it presents itself in very destructive ways, very addictive ways, and we'll talk more about what that means, I want to be very clear that a cornerstone of really good recovery from any sexual addiction is actually having a healthy relationship with sex and a healthy relationship with your own sexuality. And so, though I will be certainly talking about how it can present very destructively, I don't want to at all come across as sex negative. And I'm actually saying that knowing that there's a context out there in which historically people treating sexual addiction have unfortunately done exactly that. They've either been unintentionally or maybe knowingly kind of just sexually avoidant. Let's just not have sex anymore so that we don't go back to the addiction. We've learned the hard way that that, of course, is not the answer, that healthy sex, healthy intimacy is in fact the antidote in many ways to any addiction, including sexual addiction. So I just sort of want to put that disclaimer out there. All right, diving in. Before I did my master's in counseling, I had an undergraduate degree in math and science education, very different world. And I absolutely gravitated in many ways towards astronomy. I was in the astronomy club in college. I had a big telescope and I loved astronomy. I still do. And so this really resonates with me, that a definition of a black hole is a celestial phenomenon when a massive star collapses from its own gravity. It's so big that it just collapses in on itself. The black hole has such a strong pull that not even light can escape from it. Okay, just for those of you who know what a black hole is, you know what I'm talking about. This just, even light can't get away. And And I'd like to apply that here when we're looking at addiction interaction. When we're looking at multiple addictions, not just co-occurring, and you're going to hear me say this a few times, not just co-occurring, existing simultaneously. Oh, are you there? Christy? Did I lose everyone? Okay, wow. I think I lost Christy, but I guess you guys are still here. Okay, thank you for telling me. I'm going to try to get back into full screen. Sorry. Gosh, I don't know what I'm doing here. Thank you guys for telling me you can still see me. Full screen. Back to my presentation. Share and presentation. All right. I don't know what happened to Christy. A celestial phenomenon. Yep, we talked about that. So in addictions, this is an addiction phenomenon when multiple addictions combine to overwhelm a person by their complexity and power. The phenomenon is so strong, no specific focus is strong enough to escape it. This is what we're talking about today. I see a few things going on in the chat here. All right, nothing crazy yet. So I want to briefly talk about a client named Jonathan. Jonathan, race car mechanic, in love with the travel and romance of his career. He would later admit how much he was hooked on the stress and the excitement of his career. Eventually, travel, drug use, and compulsive infidelity created so much chaos. He's gone to treatment twice and relapsed immediately after both times. We want to start asking the question, why? Why is he getting treatment for the substance use and continually relapsing? What's going on there? A little bit more about him. During treatment, he's having a hard time focusing. There's so many problems in so many places. He admitted to constantly using various types of drugs, including heroin and cocaine, since he was about 11. He's now 48, so this is a 30-some-year-old long problem. His deeper problem, compulsively hiring sex workers. He doesn't want to acknowledge that. Married for 10 years with 3 young children, does not want to acknowledge his sexual behaviors are far more compulsive, problematic, and it interacts with his substance use. He's convinced he only acts sexually when under the influence of his substances. Many of you have maybe heard this. I only do this when I'm high. I'm only like that when I'm drunk. It's only because of the substances. So if you fix the substances, I promise I don't actually have a problem with this. Okay, sometimes that's true. I want to acknowledge that. Admitting a sexual addiction weakened his position to spend less time in treatment. He didn't want to risk losing his position on the work team. He also has a secret relationship issues. He has to clean up with these other women that we don't really know about. So Jonathan's mean old group therapist said to him one day, if you do not stop and do the work, there is no point to having a chair in this group. We are talking to a dead man. The core of his addiction is not actually the drugs. The core of his addiction is the intensity and the chaos. That's his core addiction. He is addicted to intensity and chaos. The drugs actually are serving a purpose. They actually help to manage all of the intensity and the chaos. So in many ways, the drugs serve the purpose of helping him escape or numb. The treatment plan then actually, in a very simplistic way, is to get him to slow down, to get him to learn to slow down and not continually chase the intensity, but also get him to sit in the slowness and and actually feel how dysregulating it is to slow down, because he runs to chaos because it feels comfortable. Slowing down feels extremely uncomfortable. He needs to acknowledge his multiple and interacting addictions. That's an early treatment plan goal, is that buddy, Jonathan, you're not just a substance addict, that you have multiple addictions and they are interacting with one another. And therefore, he needs to develop a more honest sobriety definition. What does it mean to be truly sober? It's not just not drinking or not using. What is a true definition and a plan for true sobriety? So I've skipped a lot of slides here that would have made this make more sense, I promise, but I want you to realize that Jonathan, after some pretty tough group interactions and a group therapist and group members that love and care and are calling out a lot of bullshit, Jonathan has this epiphany. He starts to realize that fixing one thing would not stop this process of relapse, that in fact, all of his addictions are hooked together. When he admitted that he saw it was all one problem and that it just came out in different ways, the group smiled at him. And many of you have heard that addictions, it's like you've got the gopher holes, and the gopher comes up over here and you plug that, and then the gopher comes up over here and you plug that, and the gopher keeps coming up in all these different ways, but really it's just one gopher. And at the core, we certainly need to try to address the ways the gopher comes up, but ultimately what we're looking at is just one gopher, and we're going to treat the gopher. His therapist said to him to just focus on the chemical use is why you relapse. And Jonathan would then need to understand how all of these different addictions hooked together. All hooked together, much like a chain. It starts to make sense. So let's shift into understanding multiple addictions. All right, let me pause there for a second and just make sure, because something weird happened on my end, but let me just double check that everyone is still here. Everyone's still tracking. And can someone, I'm curious, what I don't see, actually what I lost on my screen is Christy. I don't know if Christy's still here, but as long as everyone's still with me, this is perfect. Okay, great. I'm going to keep moving. You guys are awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So understanding multiple addictions. Well, addictions actually compound by nature. It is the very nature of addictions to do this. And so morphing into something more powerful and biologically tenacious. Biologically tenacious. We're looking at neural pathways. So once the initial neural pathway is laid down, other addictions become overlays using the same circuitry. What I want you to imagine is once you've got a riverbed established, new addictions don't typically form new riverbeds. They might start as a stream separate from the original riverbed of addiction. They might start as a small stream running way far away or even parallel for a while, but almost inevitably, eventually, sometimes sooner than later, that stream will find the existing riverbed, the very well-established riverbed. And since water used to run through that so freely, this new stream says, looky here, I've got an already established riverbed, and that new water starts to flow through the old riverbed. What that means for addiction is even if you dam the original addiction, maybe the primary addiction, or maybe you dam up the most presenting addiction, often the chemical addiction, the one that's easier to see, maybe it's the more consequences or immediate consequences, just damming that up. If you have another spring or even river over here that eventually intertwines itself. And then even though this is dammed up and that water's not running through the riverbed, more water now running through the old riverbed means that neural pathway, that riverbed is still every bit as active, even if the other addiction has been dammed. They may not be acting out with their chemical anymore. They are truly sober from that addiction. But if that neural pathway is still getting accessed through other means, they are, by neural pathway of definition of sobriety, their brain doesn't know the difference. They are not technically sober because that neural pathway of addiction is still getting used. Water's still going down. Okay, we'll say more about this. So what are these multiple addictions and what are these addiction neural pathways? Well, they're all represented on this picture. You have here substances, processes, or appetites. The substances are the most easily identifiable. Many of us work with those day in and day out. But processes, some individuals don't work with process addictions. And so understanding a pattern of behaviors. So you may not be actually addicted to food, but you might be addicted to the process of eating or what food has come to represent. Sex and love represent so much, and being addicted to the process of maybe the chase of sex or the chase of love, romance itself can actually be very addictive. Many of these things truly do elicit a dopaminergic response in the brain. Work, money, exercise can actually have a very much pleasure and pain component. If for any of you have read the book Dopamine Nation talks about that pleasure-pain balance that often the brain can't tell the difference between. Dopamine can still be accessed through a lot of different channels. So core affect states or addiction to feelings. We won't spend a lot of time on this today, but I want you to notice that it, in a very broad definition of an addiction to an emotion, if by definition of addiction, obsession of the mind, compulsive of behavior, continuation despite consequences, feeling powerless to stop even if I want to, commitments to myself or others to stop. Imagine how many of these emotions individuals might say, I have an addictive relationship. I'm obsessed with, I'm always thinking about how much self-loathing or shame, or I'm stuck on my own rage and I act very compulsively with my shame or my rage or my fear. Intensity and risk can be very addicting. And relationships, there's some old terms here that I don't like to use nearly as much. I don't really use codependency nearly that often anymore, but for some individuals, they still really do find usefulness in that term of understanding their own codependency or the codependency of others. Love addiction, traumatic bonding. We're not going to go in depth on these, but these are the 4 types of addictions: substance, process, core affect or feeling addictions, and relationships. If you'll notice here in the circle, going around the edge, these are the 4 addiction neural pathways. More on these in a bit, but they are arousal or pleasure, numbing, satiation. Over on the left, you have fantasy escape or dissociation. And on the bottom there, deprivation. We're going to go into this. There's a lot here. And I know that Christy is keeping track of questions. There's probably going to be quite a few, or maybe not. I don't, we're going to try to get through as much of the content first. So, addiction neural pathways. Arousal, that pleasure or that intensity neural pathway. Imagine this is the person thinking, whether consciously or not, I want to feel something other than pain. I want to feel something other than pain. Often I want to feel pleasure or intensity because it takes me out of my pain. And so I might tap into that neural pathway seeking something other than pain, pleasure, and intensity. Numbing is a neural pathway I'm wanting to not feel anything. This is the sedative analgesic effect to satiate and to just not feel. So if I'm tapping into that neural pathway, that's what I'm consciously or unconsciously looking for. Fantasy. Escape is the goal. I want to get out of my own body, or I want to get out of my own reality. In fact, any other reality is better than the one I'm living in. So I'm trying to escape. Again, this one was often referred to as the dissociative neural pathway. And lastly, deprivation. Deprivation neural pathway. This one's more about control. In fact, I'm in control of at least something, might be the phrase the person would be using. I have something, at least somewhere in my life, where everything else feels so out of control. Maybe there's one thing in my life that I can control. For those of you familiar with, and I am not an expert in sexual anorexia or working with disordered eating behaviors, it's not my specialty, but I'm learned a little bit from those who are, that often a component of that is that the person coming from a place of such terror, such a place of such fear and out of control, can find that maybe there's one thing in their life that they can control, and that might be what they put in their body. That might be this food right here, I can control that. And so when you see that and you go, oh my goodness, this person is so creatively trying to treat a world. They found a solution to a problem. The solution obviously became its own problem, but what a creative attempt at trying to find control in an otherwise out of control world. Deprivation, sexual anorexia, not a true diagnosis, but we use the term to describe something very similar. A person might say, if I deprive myself of sex or sexuality or my own sexual desires, I don't want to be seen as sexy or sexual in any way. I will avoid sex at all cost. It might be that that person has found a very creative solution to a problem, a solution that itself becomes a problem, but nonetheless a way to control in an otherwise out of control world. These are the neural pathways. Let's go even further with that. So the arousal pathway, again, about pleasure and intensity, things like high-risk sex, really risky, sexy sexual behaviors that could be with prostitutes or the risk of getting caught. High-risk sex could also be unprotected sex. And knowing that there's a risk of getting an STD or a risk of getting someone pregnant, the risk is actually the element that makes this tapping into that intensity, the arousal pathway. High-risk relationships, volatile relationships, traumatizing relationships might actually be part of an addiction, seeking that intensity. We also see compulsive burglary and shoplifting often accesses this neural pathway, that someone is in fact seeking the intensity of the act of burglary or shoplifting. We see this in the workplace. Individuals will come in with a lot of on the edge business occupations. And again, please be careful not to assume that I think that everyone doing very risky business occupations or day trading is an addict, any more than I think that every person who's having risky sex or is in some volatile relationships is an addict. I do not believe that everyone doing such things is addicted, any more than I believe that every person drinking is an alcoholic. I do believe that some people have a relationship with alcohol that's become addictive, certainly problematic. And I do believe that some people have a relationship with sex and relationships and some of these other behaviors that has crossed a line from healthy to unhealthy and maybe even truly addictive. So again, I want to put that caveat, but on the edge business occupations and day trading can be accessing this neural pathway. And anything to do with violence and volatility. So where do we see this in the substances? We often see the amphetamines, cocaine, ecstasy, etc., meth. Often these actually combine with sex. You may have certain drugs that enhance and combine with sexual behaviors or high-risk behaviors. Cocaine and meth often pair with sex. That's a whole lecture in and of itself. There's this thing called the opponent process of addiction. I mentioned earlier the pain and pleasure, pleasure and pain. Often individuals will find that the more pain, the more pleasurable. And in fact, they may even find that they cannot feel pleasure without pain. So for example, incorporating pain into the pleasure, things like the orgasm requires pain. Some individuals will say, and again, this does not mean that they are addicted. Some people, as part of their healthy sexual template, will even say that they need pain as part of their orgasm, or they can't actually orgasm without it. But we do see that also in sexual addiction as well. Or the arousal, some people say, I can't even be aroused unless there's risk. I'm not even turned on unless there's some sort of risk. That can be associated with trauma reenactment. Again, there are individuals in certain sexual communities where they need it to be risky to be aroused, and they are not addicted, and it is part of healthy sexual expression for them. I want to be very careful. Numbing. Numbing. So what are the substances often associated with this neural pathway? Well, alcohol is often associated with this. It can be associated with that arousal pathway, but often alcohol can help with numbing. I just don't want to feel. Heroin can certainly help there. But what about the process behaviors? A lot of people aren't familiar with the idea that masturbation, when done compulsively, actually taps into the numbing neural pathway in the brain. It actually becomes more of an analgesic. It is not about the orgasm. In fact, it's about using masturbation to tap into a pathway that says, as long as I'm doing this as often as I need to, I'm not feeling. It helps keep the emotions at bay. So compulsive masturbation, if you see that, ask yourself the question, what are they not wanting to feel? Certain types of gambling, we'll go into this more, but some gambling can access the arousal, gambling that's about intensity, but some types of gambling is more about the checking out or the numbing, the not wanting to feel. Shopping, again, not everyone that shops or likes to shop a lot is addicted or tapping into the numbing pathway any more that some people who like to drink more than the average Joe is an addict. But some people have found a way of tapping shopping as a numbing behavior. Similarly, overeating can actually be a form of numbing, using food as a way to not feel. We see this then combining alcohol and compulsive eating, or with the slot machine. So let me briefly describe, you walk into a casino. You may have a couple options ahead of you. You could go to the high stakes poker, to the roulette or the craps. And there what you're doing is you're wanting a type of gambling that is intense. You're wanting the flop. You're looking for the big wager, the big win, the possible windfall. But you also could walk into the same casino and go over to the slot machine. And some addicts, gambling addicts, again, not everyone that walks into the casino, but a gambling addict walks into the casino and might walk over to the slots, and they might sit down and it turns into a push the button, pull the lever, push the button, pull the lever, and that can go on for hours. Both are gambling behaviors, but two different neural pathways were being accessed there, the intensity or the numbing. Okay, just like some sexual behaviors are about the intensity of the sex, and some, like compulsive masturbation, is about the numbing aspect of it. So not all sex is arousal or numbing, and not all gambling is arousal or numbing. It kind of depends on what you're looking to gain from it. Some shopping actually could be more about intensity, and some shopping can be about numbing. So what about the neural pathway, the fantasy dissociative pathway? Well, you often will see the substances like marijuana, the psychedelics like LSD, etc. These often help a person escape from their body. Obviously, marijuana can be used to numb out. Certainly, I could have included that in the previous neural pathway, but often individuals will say that it helps them just get out of their body, kind of get out of their own head or out of their own feelings. And usually it has an escape kind of quality to it, much like the psychedelics very much do, an alternate reality. So what about process behaviors? Individuals would describe that just the act of cruising around in a car, maybe looking for hookups, maybe never even hooking up, but looking for a sex worker or looking for people who might be interested in anonymous hookups, the cruising. You also see cruising in a bar, going in, and just the act of cruising can become a very out-of-body experience. Escaping, going into the fantasy, even just the act of imagining the possible hookup. This is the idea of the dog chasing the car, but he may or may not know what to do if he were to catch the car. But the individual might be chasing, and it is potentially more about the chase than the act of catching. For some individuals, the act of watching porn may or may not be about eventually masturbating to orgasm. It might be, or that might be a final result, but they may be, in fact, just clicking. The act of clicking on the next video, the next picture is in fact a form of dissociating, checking out. Fantasy, maybe imagining the perfect hookup, the perfect woman or man or person with whom that they're most attracted to, and imagining that fantasy is a very dissociative type of behavior that some have found as part of their addiction. Engaging in online sexual behaviors can become very addictive. Sitting in a strip club could be a form of checking out or dissociative behavior. Some gambling behaviors where you're imagining the windfall, imagining the big hit, and what you're going to do when you win all of that money, how different your life is going to be, can actually be tapping into this neural pathway. Checking your day trades, again, a lot of that is about, man, what if I were to get a lot of money? In gambling, the big win. Money obsession, the windfall. With drugs, we often see this with, they're chasing, often they're chasing their first high. The best high often was the first one, but they're imagining the right high with the right stuff. They're trying to maybe get to the perfect combination. And with sex, this might be the illusory right person, the perfect scenario, situation, perfect sexual, everything comes together just right. The cosmic relationship. Often this is a fantasy, maybe or maybe not, it could be true or possible, maybe it's impossible. But when they're tapping into this in a very addictive way, what they're tapping into is a dissociative pathway. Watching our time. So lastly, that deprivation I mentioned earlier. As control is the goal, things, and we're using this term loosely, but anorexic spending or sexual anorexia, much like food anorexia, share a common assumption that doing without is the surest way to defend against terror. If I can deprive or control this, then I might have some sense of control somewhere. I can defend off all of the terror by having some place I feel in control. People studying this have actually found that there is, in fact, in the brain, a euphoric release. People will, in fact, will report even feelings of superiority or even elation. We see neurochemically a release of dopamine or even some serotonin, a sense of, like, I'm responding with a sense of euphoria when I don't do this, when I stop, when I control, when I restrict, when I deprive. And often this will intermingle with arousal, numbing, and fantasy. Okay, more on that another time, but how deprivation can in fact interact with the other three neural pathways. Now, Time for a woeful oversimplification. Arousal, usually about pain. So guys, those therapists out there that are maybe thinking, how do I apply this? Well, I'd like to give you, again, an oversimplification, but when you're thinking treatment planning, when someone comes into your office and you're seeing a lot of arousal type behaviors, whether it's the substances that are associated with arousal or the intensity seeking, a lot of just behaviors that are very intense in nature, you might be asking yourself, what is the pain this person is trying to not feel? It's usually about pain. I don't want to feel this, therefore I want to feel that, arousal. When you see a lot of numbing behaviors, a person coming in with either the substances associated with numbing, behaviors commonly associated with numbing, ask yourself, maybe your treatment plan is going to go towards an anxiety, treating anxiety, maybe an anxiety disorder or adjustment disorder with anxiety, or look for the anxiety disorders like OCD, something like that. Numbing is often what they're trying to treat their own anxiety. When you see a lot of fantasy or deprivation type behaviors, you see this preoccupation and obsession is usually associated with shame. They have individuals' own self-perception. It's better to be outside of my body than it is to be in my body. I hate myself maybe so much that it's easier to be in another reality. My reality is so bad, any other reality is better. So when you see fantasy, dissociative type drugs, substances, and or behaviors, ask yourself, what's the core self-belief that this individual has that is so bad that being outside of themselves is the best option? And lastly, we've said this a few times, when you see deprivation, it's usually about terror. The question is, how is this person using something to deprive as a form of maybe managing their terror? These can guide your treatment planning. All right, a little bit more. Which neural pathway is being used? The gambling addict walks into a casino, has a choice. I mentioned this. The high stakes poker could be for arousal or to numb out and even slip into a trance. That's the slot machines. An alcoholic may use alcohol to bury her trouble. Could be to numb, or she may also use alcohol to disinhibit herself. More on this here in a bit. To take part in high-risk behaviors. You're asking yourself, what is the alcohol serving? What purpose? What neural pathway are we tapping into? A sex addict may use anonymous sex because it's so high risk. The excitement of, I don't know this person, they don't know me, what could happen? It's dangerous maybe. That might be more about arousal, at which point you're going, what's the pain? Or are they using other behaviors? Example was compulsive masturbation. Is the sexual behavior being used in a way that's actually more about numbing than arousal? Therefore, you're asking yourself, what are they numbing? Is there an anxiety there? Add porn for hours, you might also have even tapped into that fantasy and escape. Now, we've mentioned interacting neural pathways. Addictions used for any one of the neural pathways can act alone. They truly can act alone, or they can and often do interact with other neural pathways. Let's give one example. So arousal followed by numbing, or a little bit of everything. Sex addict spends the evening cruising. They've been tapping into that fantasy neural pathway. They didn't catch anything. Nothing happened. They didn't complete the fantasy, but they're fantasizing about taking part in high-risk sex. Maybe they did actually take part in high-risk sex, but then they return home and they're so zipped up after now the heightened arousal, they can't sleep. Well, they need to now numb the anxiety maybe that they're feeling, the despair, the feelings that they're feeling because they just acted out. and they feel bad about it. Maybe there's shame. So they turn to something like alcohol, food, TV, compulsive porn, and masturbation. In fact, now to calm down, to numb. So we've now found several behaviors all linked together, serving a purpose of getting out of my own body, seeking intensity to escape pain, and now seeking numbing to escape the shame of what I just did. And that can start all over again. This pattern of arousal followed by numbing is very common in combination in addictive disorders. We see this in, just strictly substance use. You often see uppers followed by downers. That balancing act, that perfect cocktail that individuals are often seeking. But imagine someone who does that with a substance and a process, that maybe the substance is the upper, but a process is the downer. Or maybe the substance is the downer and a process, a behavior is the upper, or is the escape, or you can start to combine all of these together. Deprivation often serves as a kind of twin for excessive behavior. In fact, you can have a period of binging, so going hard on something like an arousal behavior or going hard on something like a numbing behavior. And then you can have a period of time where you purge that and you deprive yourself of it and say, I'm not going to do it anymore, and avoid that arousal or avoid that numbing behavior. And that then becomes its own cycle of binge purge, much like we see in food binge purge, but we can see that with lots of behaviors paired together to create a balancing act. So I've said this, addictions more than coexist, they interact and reinforce and become part of one another. They become packages. So we're going to now look at a few different types of interactions. How do they interact with one another? I'm watching our time. We've got a little bit of time left, and I want to save time for questions. So we're covering a lot of territory. So cross-tolerance. Cross-tolerance is a type of interaction. There's two parts of this. One is where you have the simultaneous increase in an addictive behavior in two or more addictions. So the more I drink, the more sexual behavior and the more sexual behavior, the more I drink. And so as I build up a tolerance in one, I build up a tolerance in the other, and they go up simultaneously, increasing together. It's called cross tolerance. But the other one is in fact really fascinating. It's a transfer of tolerance, meaning I might be a really high drinker and have developed a tolerance for alcohol. And then I start something like a chemical maybe. And whereas if I didn't already have the tolerance for alcohol, I would have needed to build up over time a tolerance for cocaine. But we often see someone who already has a high tolerance for alcohol might be able to jump over into cocaine, and we're shocked at how quickly they're able to do high doses of cocaine that they shouldn't normally be able to do, but they already had a tolerance for something else. And interestingly enough, if they were using the alcohol for the arousal neural pathway, for example, and now they're using the cocaine for the same arousal neural pathway, they already had an established riverbed, and they added a new chemical that's attached to the same riverbed. So they built up a tolerance really quickly. The riverbed was already established. But if the alcohol was being used for numbing, meaning I'm using alcohol to not feel, and then I add cocaine, but I'm using cocaine as a arousal, it might take a little longer because I'm not actually accessing the same riverbeds. The alcohol was for numbing, the arousal, the cocaine was for arousal. So it's not always true, but sometimes if you're using the different behaviors or substances for the same purpose, the same neural pathway, that cross tolerance will happen a lot faster because they're using the same riverbed. Withdrawal mediation is when one addiction serves to moderate, relieve, or avoid withdrawal from one another. Now, when you walk into pretty much every AA meeting in the world, you often see a coffee machine, and people smoking, and usually cookies or donuts. There's a reason for that. Often individuals will even say, not all, but often individuals will say that they really shot up their smoking, or they started smoking actually when they started withdrawing from alcohol, or they were eating way more sugary often things when they were withdrawing. And if you're using one chemical or behavior to moderate or mediate the withdrawal of another, then that can turn into a new addiction if you're not careful. That's called withdrawal mediation. Withdrawal mediation, the use of something else, and it can become its own addiction. Replacement sounds like withdrawal mediation, but there's actually a time factor. When one addiction replaces another with the majority of emotional and behavioral features, this could be 6 months or a year down the road. I may not have started this new thing it may not have been withdrawal mediation. It truly may not have started until I had already withdrawn. I was not going through withdrawals. 6 months to a year later, I'm in recovery from this substance, but then I might add a new substance or behavior that actually shares a lot of the same neural pathways. I may find something else that's a numbing agent, or something else that's a arousal intensity, or something else that's about escape. And I can now develop a new addiction to that, because again, I may have dammed the riverbed from this first addiction, but a year later, I still have a well-established dry riverbed. And if I'm not careful, adding something new to it, it's a well-made riverbed that water can freely flow down. So that can happen. Individuals can replace one addiction with another with the emotional and behavioral features: arousal, numbing, fantasy, deprivation. Alternating addiction cycles, where they cycle back and forth in a pattern of systematic ways. One example was, there was an example of a female who came in for treatment, and she, in periods of highly compulsive sexual behavior, she would restrict or control her food intake. So I want you to hear: out of control sexual behavior, hyper controlled food. So she would actually lose a ton of weight, but then this individual would get married when she felt like she was looking her best. She felt so much more attractive. She actually got married, but in the marriage, things would flip. In the marriage, she would then flip, and now her sexual behavior was hyper restricted. In fact, to a degree of what we would call sexually anorexic. Hyper controlled sex, but guess what happened? The food, out of control. So now out of controlled eating. Okay, notice the balancing act. She then put on a ton of weight, gained about 100 pounds. Unfortunately, the marriage ended. She then flipped again. Now, out of control sex, hyper controlled food, loses the weight, marries again. She did this 4 times. 4 marriages. And in each marriage, the sexual behavior was constricted. The food was out of control. Between each marriage, the food was out of control, and between marriages, the food was hyper controlled and the sex was out of control. This is called alternating addiction cycles. The treatment plan needed to include a treatment for both, addressing this pattern. And if you were to only treat the out of controlled eating, if you were to only treat when she's restricting her eating, and you would miss the relationship with sex that sometimes was out of control or sometimes was hyper controlled, then it's truly not a full treatment plan. You need to address both sides of the cycle. Masking. This slide doesn't always seem to work for me. There it is. Masking, when an addict uses one addiction to cover up for another, perhaps more substantive addiction. I don't want to look at this, so I'm going to say, no, my problem is with this. Often, no, I don't have a problem with sex. It's just I'm an alcoholic. Fix my relationship with alcohol. I won't have a problem with sex. That's called masking. There's plenty of examples of that. Ritualizing, addictive behavior of one addiction serves as a ritual, a part of, I need to do this so that I can engage in something else. When you start to pair them together as part of a larger ritual, it's called ritualizing. And then intensification. Intensification, where you have partial fusion. This could be partial. The addict combines addictions in such a fashion to be more potent than each addiction separately. But the partial means the addictions are used independently part of the time, meaning I like to use methamphetamine with my sexual behavior, but I can use meth without being sexual, and I can be sexual without using meth. But I like to combine them together because it makes it better. Partial. Whereas full fusion, or what's called fusion dependence, is that neither addiction is separate and it's not sufficient, meaning only a simultaneous use is sufficient. This is the meth sex, or what we call chemsex connection. The individual at this point coming to treatment says, I can't be sexual without meth. And I can't use meth without it always turning into sexual. Chemsex, full fusion, you actually have to treat both. You have to treat both. All right, I'm going to stop there and just come back here. I'm looking, we don't have a ton of time, but I really want to open up to talk to everyone for a little bit. And I know some of you will need to go right at 1, but.
Right. Well, that great
Hi.
presentation. We do have quite a few questions. We had multiple around the fact that there's many neuropathways. So, you know, in conjunction with that, first he says, aren't there many neuropathways? And in conjunction to that, somebody else asked, where does love addiction fall into that? So 2-part question, 2 birds, 1 stone.
Okay, say that again. I apologize.
So somebody, Jack has asked, aren't there many neuropathways?
So this is referring to the 4 addiction neural pathways. There are plenty of neural pathways out there, but what Carnes, and I don't know who he was also referencing, I apologize, but what Carnes talks about is that there are 4 addiction neural pathways, and that's the arousal pathway, the numbing, the fantasy, and the deprivation. Great question.
Perfect. So where does love addiction fall on the in the pathways?
Love addiction is almost invariably, typically, a part of any of them, because what you need to ask the person is, what is their seeking of love? Just like a person walks into a casino, ask them, what are they trying to achieve? Because some people, their romance addiction or their love addiction, that limerence, what they're seeking is the high, or they're seeking actually very volatile love intensity. They're seeking love that is that neural pathway. Others are seeking romance and love that is in fact very satiating, and it calms them down, maybe even more than calms, but it serves as a numbing agent.
Okay.
And so love addiction actually doesn't fit just one.
Okay. All right. So somebody was wondering if you can talk about differentiating between sexual addictions and kink positivity.
Yes. So always want to be very careful that you are asking an individual if they're talking about kink behavior, and if this is not a time to discuss a lecture on kink behavior, but if they're talking about behavior that for them is highly arousing as part of their sexual behavior, ask them, is it a problem for them? And if it's not causing a problem in their life, it's not hurting themselves or hurting another person, it may not be a part of an addiction for them. By definition of addiction, it's something that is obsessive to a point of like a preoccupation, to the point of, I can't stop thinking about this much of the time of the day, or I'm acting on it compulsively, even if I don't want to, or I feel like I need to. There's a compelled component. A lot of people with healthy kink don't describe an obsessive or compulsive relationship to it. They feel it's life-giving. It's a part of a sexual expression for them. That's not addiction. And so you want to
Okay.
be very clear that you're delineating, like if someone says, no, I do think this is problematic, it could have been healthy kink for a time that crossed over into addictive kink. Much like someone used to say they drank and they had a good time and it wasn't a problem, but then alcohol took on a new relationship and they developed an addiction. Something that was healthy could have become unhealthy over time.
Okay. All right. So I have somebody just popped in. Can you speak a little to the role of attachment in these various types of addictions?
The role of attachment in various types of addiction. So I actually love to look at addiction from the attachment lens in this way. Believing that all addictions at its core really is a form of intimacy disorder or a disordered relationship with intimacy. At its core, what we're saying is, or what we're presupposing is that an individual, whether in early childhood, young adult, or even in their adult experiences, somewhere along the way, there was an attachment wounding. There was a relational wounding, something that to the person said, whether consciously or not, I don't believe I can trust humans, human attachments, relationships to meet my needs. Some core belief was installed maybe early on, and it may not have been one event. It could have been, death by 1,000 paper cuts. It could have been just multiple repeat attachment wounds that somewhere the message was, I can't trust others to help me feel okay, or to help me not hurt, or to help me feel better about myself. And so if that attachment wound is so strong, I'm going to then try to survive some way. Again, we believe that most people are just trying to get by. I might find that a substance or a behavior, a process of some type, a relationship even, might meet that need, but it could be the unhealthy form of a relationship, because I don't trust that healthy people will ever meet my needs. So I turn to a substance, a process, a behavior, because that actually for a while does what it promises. That substance actually helps me feel better or not feel anything, or it helps me escape my body. So the solution for a while works. But at its core, if every addiction is an attachment disorder or a intimacy disorder, what that also means is the treatment ultimately is teaching individuals to take risks with humans, teaching people to lean back into those vulnerable spaces that, as many of you have heard, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Teaching that connection really is that antidote. That's an attachment way of looking at addiction, I think.
Right. Wow, great presentation. There are a couple more questions. If you want to stay on and answer them, you can. We still have quite a few hanging on. And so we have, how does EMDR fit in with addiction treatment?
Ooh, EMDR fits in with addiction treatment in a lot of fascinating ways. That's a lecture right there. And I need to be honest, I'm still very much a newbie in many ways with my EMDR, trying to incorporate it. But again, if what you're looking at is at its core, that addiction, if just what I just said, if you believe that addiction is at its core an intimacy disorder, a solution to it was at one point a solution to a problem. And if that problem was attachment woundings, core shame beliefs, EMDR does this great thing where it says, tell me about the first time that happened, or tell me about the worst time that happened. And often says, let's go back to that place and use what EMDR does and bilateral stimulation and accessing the free association of the brain to kind of do its own work, get out of the talking therapy and into just letting the brain heal. EMDR allows the person to actually go back and heal those original attachment wounds and lower the volume of that core belief, that core negative belief, and then replace it with a new, more positive core belief that says, you know what, I actually want to believe, and I do believe this about myself, or I believe this about humans. And maybe the core belief was, I can't trust. And the new belief is, I can learn to trust, or I can choose to trust safe people. And that actually might help them engage in a more deeper way with a sponsor, with their meetings, with their therapist, even with trusted loved ones, because at one point, I couldn't trust humans to meet my need, and a substance did that for me. So of course I turned to the substance again and again and again. But if EMDR helped me replace a core belief that I can trust humans, or I can trust safe humans, I might then lean more into a recovery space than by my old substance or behavior.
Okay.
That's one answer.
It was a great answer. We're going to call it right now. That was such a fabulous, fabulous presentation. Many comments from all of our attendees about how appreciative they are. What I want to say to those of you still on is that our next webinar is May 25th. It's presented by Dr. Letitia Bader with Women's Recovery. It's a path to women's wellness and recovery. So I will include the link. I will include Stephen's contact information in the email with the certificates, and as well as the link to this presentation on our website. I am so appreciative of everybody who took the time today to join us. Stephen, amazing. So grateful for you being here today. And maybe we can get you back, because there was a lot of people wanting to go off on 1,000 other different topics. And so maybe we can talk you into joining us later.
I'd be happy to. Thank you all so much for having me.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.